Welcome to Transcending Comics, a podcast dedicated to trans representation in comic books, manga, and webtoons, both on panel and behind the scenes. I'm your host, Tommy, and joining me today is one of my favorite science fiction novelists and podcasters who's recently made her way into the world of comics. She's a Hugo and Nebula award-winning writer for her novels 6 Months, 3 Days and All the Birds in the Sky, respectively, and the author of several other beloved novels like the Unstoppable Trilogy and The City in the Middle of the Night, and short story collections like Even Greater Mistakes and Never Say You Can't Survive. She's also written highly acclaimed articles for The Washington Post, Wired, and IO9. When she's not writing, she's the co-host of a delightful podcast, Our Opinions Are Correct, alongside Annalee Newitz, which has won the Hugo Award for Best Fan Cast on 3 separate occasions. In the realm of comics, she's the writer of the most recent New Mutants run from Marvel, and the co-creator of Escapade, a transgender superhero and a recent fan-favorite mutant. With no further ado, I'd like to give a big welcome to today's guest, Charlie Jane Anders.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's so awesome to be here.
Glad you can make it. Now, I know you're finishing up your first miniseries at Marvel and finishing up the last couple issues of the previous New Mutants run, along with being featured in a few different anthologies. So, coming off this big debut, how are you feeling about your first foray into comics?
I had so much fun. It was just such a blast. I just, getting that opportunity to come up with a new character and work with these incredible artists, Ted Brandt and Rose Stein, on coming up with the look of the character and kind of the vibe of the character was such a wonderful process. I had such a blast, and I got to play in the Marvel universe and just kind of goof around and mostly got to do whatever I wanted, which was super awesome. It was such a fun project. I had such a good time. And it's been so great to see so many people embracing Escapade and loving her appearances in the New Mutants comics and everything. It's been a blast. I've always wanted to kind of do more playing around with the form of comics, the ways that you could use the format of comics to kind of tell a story more efficiently, but also more playfully. And I got to do some stuff in those Escapade comics that I was really happy with how it turned out.
Now, one of the things that really stood out to me with Escapade as a character was the part of her power set where she's able to take the place of other people, and as long as she acts believably, no one around her notices. And I couldn't help but notice that this felt reminiscent of a form of masking or passing as literally part of her abilities. Was this always an intentional aspect of the character when creating a transgender superhero, or was this just kind of a happy little accident that happened to play into the themes that well?
Yeah, I love that. That power set, the ability to trade places, was something that I had come up with years and years earlier. It was something that I had been thinking about creating, one or more superheroes back in the day. And there was actually a point at which I was talking to a completely different editor at Marvel. In 2017, I had an idea for a comic with brand new characters, and one of the characters was going to have that power set, and it didn't even get very far in those conversations. But that was when I started thinking about that would be a cool power set for someone to have. It's a power set that's sort of, you can use it to commit mayhem and violence, but it's also a power set that allows you to win without violence in a lot of situations. It allows you to win through trickery or through just cunning. And so when we started talking about creating Escapade, I sort of came back to that idea. I think that early on, one of my first thoughts about Escapade is that she should be kind of a trickster, because I love trickster characters. I love characters who play pranks and who kind of mess around with powerful people, or who kind of subvert authority or whatever, and who pull heists, or who are, just kind of slippery characters. And, when I thought about it, that power set really fit well. And I do feel obviously, you want to avoid the pitfall of being all trans people are tricksters, or trans people are tricking you, or trans people are pretending or play acting. But I do feel for a lot of us, there's a certain amount of having to be clever about how we move through the world in order to kind of get through situations. And anytime that you're somebody who's part of a stigmatized group, there's a certain amount of cleverness that you have to use just to kind of get through your day, I guess.
How does she compare to the other trans characters you've written, both in your prose fiction and elsewhere?
It was important to me that Escapade be a full, well-rounded character and not just be defined by her transness. And so that idea that she's a trickster, somebody who steals from the rich, somebody who's kind of a con artist and a kind of just a clever rogue, that felt really essential to the character beyond her being trans.
Mm.
That's just who she is for a variety of reasons. And so that was something that I was really excited to explore, but I feel like it all does kind of go together. And, I've written plenty of trans characters in my prose fiction. And actually, the comics also have Morgan, who's like this. I've written plenty of trans characters who are just earnest and straightforward, and what you see is what you get. And they're just trying to live and be themselves in a world that's like hostile. But I love coming back to that idea of someone who is kind of sneaky, who's a sneaky character and who kind of pulls one over on the bad guys. So that was kind of where that all came from, I guess. But it did at times kind of bring up some interesting things of like Escapade being put into situations where she was pretending to be somebody very different. And, you do have to get good at pretending sometimes, I think.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm curious about the timeline of you coming on to the end of the previous New Mutants run before the Lethal Legion mini. Did you already know going into those last 3 or 4 issues that Escapade was going to be the main character of your series? Or did you ever have to look through the other mutants and the other characters on the book as a potential protagonist instead?
Yeah, I mean, so what happened is the first story with Escapade, which really is honestly, like, I think of everything I wrote with Escapade as being a 9-part story, and it just happened to be scattered across kind of 3 different books. And I hope people will track down all 9 parts because I feel like it reads differently if you read the whole thing. So the first time I wrote Escapade was in the 2022 Pride issue. And that was just like introducing the character, introducing her best friend Morgan, and also their pet flying turtle, Hibbert, and kind of introducing this kind of situation that Escapade was dealing with where she got a prophecy that she would bring about the death of her best friend Morgan. And so she had to take drastic action to try and prevent that. And originally, what I had been told, or what we'd kind of said was, we're going to introduce the character in the Pride issue, and then we're going to spin her off into her own book. And then kind of word came down that they weren't launching as many new books with new characters as they had thought they were going to do. And they were like, well, we can't do that right now because Marvel's changing direction with that. But meanwhile, Vita Ayala, had just come off this incredible run on New Mutants, just like one of my favorite runs of the last several years, just so phenomenal. So Vita was, at first it was just going to be a hiatus. Vita was taking a hiatus on New Mutants. And they were like, do you want to come in and write, a few issues while Vita's gone? And use that to just, they told me right up front, like Sarah Brunstad, my editor, was super awesome about just being like, use this to kind of tell more of Escapade's story. Turn some of the stuff that you were going to do with Escapade into 3 issues of New Mutants. And I was like, sure, yeah, great. And so that's what I did.
So making that transition for Escapade's story, shifting away from a solo-focused book to not just an ensemble team book, but one that had already been running for a few dozen issues. How did you go about reshaping the story into something that would both continue what Vita Ayala had set up in the preceding issues, while also doing Escapade justice and carrying on the themes that had been going for most of the book?
I knew that this wasn't like a brand new comic that they were launching out of the blue. It was a thing where people had been reading New Mutants and had been reading Vita's run. And so I had to really, I'd already read Vita's run like once or twice. So I went back and reread it like again. And I did put a lot of thought into like how to make it feel like a continuation of Vita's run while also telling a new story, and how to treat all those characters with respect. And, it was really fun to do that because thematically, Vita's run was so rich and had so many themes of like restorative justice and like community and like mentorship, like the themes of like mentorship and, these characters who had been the young mutants originally now getting to mentor the next generation was so cool in the way that Vita did it that I was able to kind of pick up some of that and just carry that along. And I felt a responsibility. Even once we jumped into doing a separate New Mutants Lethal Legion miniseries, which was kind of, again, I was told, you can definitely put Escapade front and center because we want to feature that character. I felt even more of a responsibility to kind of feature as many as I could of like the classic New Mutants characters. And, it was a process of kind of figuring out how to write those characters my way and in a way that felt consistent with what they'd been doing before. You don't want to just be like doing karaoke of somebody else's version of a character. You want to kind of tell an interesting story about the character, which you can only do if you've really gotten inside the character a little bit more. So, there was a process of kind of like learning to do those characters respectfully. And I feel like at a certain point, I was really confident in writing them. It's tough to take over a team book with that many characters, and especially like trying to integrate some new characters. And also, I really was having a lot of fun writing Scout and writing some of the other newer characters that Vita had really been introducing into New Mutants. So it was a really fun process, but I did want it to feel like I was honoring everything that had come before in New Mutants while kind of going in a different direction.
As far as things you brought to the book that stood out to me, I really loved your Charlie Brown style origin strips throughout the book. And I thought that was a really genius way to give us a lot about Morgan and Sheila's history without even dedicating a full page to it. So I'd love to know where this idea came from, and just using the kind of Peanut style artwork as a means of backstory exploration.
Yeah, that was one of the things I was kind of referring to earlier when I talked about using the form of comics to tell the story like more playfully and more efficiently. And like that, I mean, if you get a chance to read the Pride issue, which is where Escapade's introduced, that's where those newspaper strips really that's where we started doing them. And that's where we really use them to tell a lot of the story of Escapade. They gave me 20 pages to kind of introduce the character and set up future storylines, which is for an anthology comic like that, just a huge amount. It's a lot of space to get to play with, because usually the stories in those things are like 3 to 5 pages, maybe 6 if you're lucky. So it was basically the length of a whole comic book, like a normal comic. But I had so much ground I wanted to cover. There was so much stuff I wanted to get through. I wrote I was outlining and outlining and outlining and just writing different scenes. And I came up with all this stuff about how Sheila came out. Like I had this whole thing I wanted to do where Sheila first comes out to her parents as a mutant, and they're like, oh, we support you. You got your genes from us. And so we're the reason you're a mutant. And of course we support you. And, we think it's awesome. And then later she comes out to them as trans, and they're like, you're an abomination and it's social contagion. And you've been looking at YouTube, and we're going to send you to a therapist to fix you and stuff. And I had whole scenes of that, which were really they were a gut punch, and they would have been really intense to have on the page, but they took up so much space, and you didn't want the backstory to just kind of overwhelm the front story or the main story of the comic book, which is where we're setting up all the fun stuff that's going to happen later. And I was like, I don't have room to tell all the backstory I want to tell. And I just sort of thought about different ways that you could use comics to kind of tell a story in a very short space. And those newspaper strips felt perfect because, you'll have 3 panels, and those 3 panels will tell a complete story. And because it's so stripped down and simplified and kind of, it's just usually set up payoff, you can do a lot in those 3 panels. And so I sort of proposed that, and Ted and Roe really ran with it and had such a fun time with it. And I was so happy that when we moved Escapade over to New Mutants, I was like, can we keep those newspaper strips going? Because I was having fun with them, and I thought I could continue to use them to kind of deepen the backstory of Escapade and Morgan. And Sarah was into it, and we came up with the money to hire Ted and Roe to keep doing them for those 3 issues of New Mutants. And I was so when I was doing the kind of climax of, not going to get into spoiler territory, but when I was doing the climax of issue 33, where a lot of stuff that I've been setting up has to pay off, and I didn't have a lot of time to kind of do that. And I wanted to be super emotional and kind of feel like I'm an emotional catharsis that Escapade's having, and getting to do that thing where you have the newspaper strip running through the middle of the page instead of the bottom of the page. And it's kind of breaking up this really intense moment of action. I was that felt like a way to kind of dramatize Escapade's inner state that felt really I love that page. I feel like it really hits for me every time I look at it. So I was just so happy that worked out.
So with these 3 panel strips using such a recognizable cartoon style from a property not owned by Disney or Marvel, were there ever any concerns regarding potential legal issues or a cease and desist putting a stop to your New Mutants run?
Yeah, we had to run it past the Marvel attorneys, who basically were if you draw, I forget what it was, but there are certain things that if you draw them a certain way, you are going to get sued by, certain newspaper strips. But if you draw them slightly differently, you won't get sued. And so it was this, I forget exactly what it was, but there were certain things that you couldn't quite do them a particular way. or you were going to be in legal trouble. But if you did them a little bit differently, then it was fine. So I was just so happy that worked out.
So coming into New Mutants after Vita Ayala, I know you weren't just following up on another writer's run and figuring out how to make things work on your own terms, but you were also stepping into a really bold and different era of X-Men comics with this Krakoa era that's been going on these last few years. And I mean, I know so many people when they write comics are channeling the stories they had in their mind growing up, like maybe watching X-Men cartoons or the movies or reading classic Claremont comics, things like that. So what was it like going into such a different era of X-Men in a world where such different stories aren't just possible, but they're necessary because we're hardly even playing with the same pieces anymore?
Yeah, I mean, as I came in, I was honestly kind of daunted by the Krakoa era because, like, I read pretty much everything that had been published up till that point, like all the Hickman stuff, all of like everything that, everybody else had been doing during and since the Hickman era. And like, I loved it all so much. Like, it's just, they have been knocking it out of the park. Like, they're just some of the best X-Men comics ever done. And like, it gave me a similar feeling to when I read Grant Morrison's New X-Men of just like, wow, okay, all of a sudden the X-Men are fresh and exciting and weird and interesting again. And like, I'd almost forgotten how cool and interesting the X-Men could be. No shade to any other X-Men runs, but I really loved all those Krakoa era comics. But at the same time, it was a little daunting because, it felt like a lot to try to slot into. It was a huge, complicated status quo. I didn't necessarily have any stories that I could think of to tell in Krakoa, partly because it's paradise and partly because my thing with superheroes is always that I really like it when I like that Spider-Man is just swinging around New York and kind of dealing with the everyday problems of a person in New York. I feel like that's something that's very relatable to me. And so I was like, I didn't want characters that were just going to embrace Krakoa right off the bat and be like, yeah, we're now going to go live in Krakoa forever. But also, I just thought it was interesting to kind of critique it. And in a way that other people had critiqued the Krakoa era within the pages of the comics for sure. There had been an implicit critique all along. But at the same time, I sort of felt like I felt like I had stuff I wanted to say about nationalism and about this idea of having closed borders and sealing your borders to outsiders that felt really intense and interesting to talk about. I personally think that the nation state was a terrible idea and that we should abolish nations.
I really liked Morgan's use as a means of like showing this hesitation toward the X-Men and the whole Krakoa era in general. And I was just curious if like when you were drafting the story, if it had been important for you to include like an outgroup mutant to show the complicated relationship that a lot of these more disenfranchised mutants are feeling towards this current era of X-Men.
As much as I love a trickster, and especially a trickster who has a lot to learn, which is what Escapade is, I also love kind of a cynical, sorry, you're probably going to see my cat walk in front of the camera. Oh, there he goes. Just knocked everything off the table. As much as I love like a naive trickster like Escapade, I also love kind of a cynical character who wears their heart on their sleeve the way Morgan does. I also felt like it was interesting to have characters who weren't entirely on board with the status quo and had their own perspective, just because it's always interesting to follow people who don't agree with everybody else and who don't endorse what everybody else is signing up with. And it just sort of helped make Morgan's character more interesting too, because Morgan is just completely like, Morgan is kind of a romantic. Morgan has these kind of like romantic ideas of friendship, romantic ideas of like, it's us against the world, but at the same time is very cynical about certain things, including like politics and the idea that like we can create a nation or a nation state that's actually going to be a good thing.
I like that we're getting that more cynical take, especially as like we've now had a few years to explore this era and graduate from like this initial shock of like, hey, there's a place mutants can be safe, to like, hey, there's a thing that's drastically changing the reputation of mutants. And it's more controversial than maybe we previously expected. Like, I don't think a lot of us saw this going this route when they first kicked this off. And I'm excited to see how they wrap it up, since it's my cursory knowledge of the franchise is that yeah, there's some kind of Fall of X event coming up, and that like we're probably going to see another huge status quo shift here.
Yeah, I mean, as we're recording this, Fall of X has already started. It's gotten pretty intense. Yeah, I mean, I'm loving everything that they're doing over there, and it's just been such a thrill to see it taking shape.
As far as shifting your writing style toward comics, like, I mean, I know you have a ton of experience writing novels and short stories for decades now, and I'd love to know how you went about adapting your writing style for comic scripts and learning to rely on your artists for such a major part of the storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, that was a huge process. And like, I think that the thing that kind of saved me is that I knew it was going to be a huge process. Like, I didn't go into it expecting it to be easy. Like, I feel like I've definitely seen things where like there are writers whose novels I love who are like great prose authors, and then they start writing comics, and it's like, yeah, you're not really making the transition. And I sort of wonder if sometimes if it's because they're just like, oh, I know what I'm doing. I've been writing forever. I can totally do this. And like, I love throwing myself into situations where it's like kind of starting over and you get to be a beginner again because when you've been writing for a while, it's very easy to just be like, yeah, I do know what I'm doing. It's just I always do it this way, and I put in the eggs and the flour and the whatever, and like, and I end up with a cake and blah blah blah. I actually have no idea how to make a cake, but so to our listeners out there, like, please send me your cake recipes, or just send me cake. I don't know. I'm never going to bother to make cake, so just send me cake. I love throwing myself into new situations. And yeah, I mean, I feel like you could see me having a learning curve. If you read like some of the earliest stuff I wrote for Marvel, like I wrote some stuff for like Women of Marvel and for some of the War of the Realms crossover events, I wrote some little bits and pieces for that. You can kind of see how I'm trying to cram too much into the page. I'm trying to cram too much dialogue and too many words into everything. And that's sort of a failure mode, I think, of like, especially the too many words thing is a failure mode of prose authors trying to get into comics. And I knew it was a failure mode, but I still kind of did it for a while because it's so hard to break the habit. And I feel like getting to the point where, yeah, you can just trust the artist to convey something. The flip side of that is that you have to get really good at communicating with the artist and being collaborative with the artist from the beginning, which is, that's a process. And part of why I would love to have a longer run on a comic is just because I feel like the longer you work with a particular artist, the better your communication is going to be. And the more you're going to understand what to expect from each other and the best way to get a good result working with this person. And so I would love to have a thing where I work with an artist for like 20 or 30 issues and really we start to kind of become more of a well-oiled machine. But I feel like, yeah, it's just learning how to tell a story efficiently in comics because the space constraints are just insane. So yeah, it's been a process and like just learning how to use the page layout, like to the extent that like I dictate the page layout and versus the artist dictate, but to the extent that you can like be like every page has to like draw the eye to something. And here's the thing that we're trying to draw the eye to on this page. That's something that I really had to think about and learn.
As for wanting to explore this medium with an artist for a longer run or a longer series, I know you've mentioned elsewhere that you've wanted to try your hand at like the creator-owned comic space. Do you have any plans in the immediate future of going about the creator-owned process or even other big two comics that you can shed some light on?
Yeah, I mean, currently one of the things that I'm working on right now as we speak is pitching some creator-owned comics, and that's a whole process. I feel like in some cases, you need to write a big chunk of the script before you can sell it to a publisher. In other cases, like if you're working with Image, you need to basically have like some stuff drawn already. You have to have like an artist lined up and you have to have sample pages and a bunch of other stuff. And so I'm working on, kind of putting together submission packages for that. And that's a huge process. That's like something that's like time consuming and kind of tricky. But I have like 2 or 3 projects that I'm really excited about that I would like to get off the ground as soon as possible. And I'm just sort of working on those. I'm also trying to finish revising a novel and some novellas. So there's a lot of stuff on the back burner right now. But I really want to do more creator-owned comics. And I feel like having now kind of cut my teeth in doing stuff for Marvel, I feel like the next step for me was really to try to do some creator-owned stuff and see what I can do, kind of stretching out a little bit more.
Now, as far as like having adapted your writing style for one and going back to the other for your upcoming novels and novellas. Is there anything you've learned from your time writing comics so far that you think you'll take with you or that'll influence your novel writing style going forward?
Yeah, I love that question. I feel like anytime you stretch your writing brain in a new direction and kind of force it to think differently about telling a story, it always kind of comes back into your other writing. Like I found this when I was first started working on television shows, the way that you plan a story on television, like first you kind of figure out the big ideas, and then you break the season where like you figure out like here's the number of episodes we have and here's roughly what's going to happen in each episode. And then you kind of get more granular by each character. And then finally you're starting to break each episode, and then you go scene by scene, and you're just covering the wall with index cards and covering like you have whiteboards that are just covered with like tons and tons of stuff. And it's super interesting to do it that way. And it's a different way of thinking about the structure of storytelling for sure. And like how to pace your story and how to like make the story feel like it's just constantly moving forward. So doing that definitely came back into my novel writing. And yeah, doing the comics, I think I'm definitely finding now that, I mean, obviously comics are such a visual medium that you can't necessarily lift some of those lessons into prose books, prose fiction, but you can kind of think about like the emotional impact of things and the way you set up things and pay them off, and the way that you cut between different storylines. Like it's just, I don't know, it definitely is like a thing that's going to change the way I think about writing going forward. But I also think it just helps keep your brain kind of limber to be like trying different modes of writing.
In one of your essays in Never Say You Can't Survive, you had the suggestion of completing a first draft of a story as quickly as possible, since it's hard to know what a story is really about or what it's trying to do until we know the ending. And I'm curious if you were able to put this same advice into practice with writing comics, or if that's too severely affected by having an undetermined length of a series or having to keep things going perpetually in the second act forever, depending on the series.
I mean, I feel like deadlines change everything. Like there was the way that you approach writing when you're just like, I'm working on a thing. It's going to be done when it's done. I'm going to play around. I'm going to try different stuff. When you have a deadline and you have to produce something by a certain date, or the machinery all breaks down, which is the way it is with comics. And it's the way it is sometimes when you have book contracts too. Like I have a novel that I'm kind of running late with right now. So I'm trying to like crank things up to high gear. I feel like deadlines just inject this note of desperation that you're just like, I'm going to get things done however I can, kind of. And with the comics, I mean, generally what I was doing is outlining, and so I was doing a couple passes of the outline. And so the thing I found with comics in particular is no matter how good my outline was, when I started writing the issue, stuff that I would just find cool moments that I wanted to include in there. And there was stuff where I was like, oh, okay, well, it's going to take them 3 pages to do X, Y, and Z. And then I would get to the actual issue and I'd be like, well, actually, it could take them 1 page to do X, Y, and Z because I can skip over a lot of that stuff that I planned. And that frees up space for this other moment that I really want to have in there. And, oftentimes it's a little bit of a Jenga. So, like, especially in New Mutants Lethal Legion number 5, there was a lot of stuff where I was like, okay, I want these conversations between Escapade and Sarabella that I've been waiting for them to have. And where do I put those where they're going to make sense? And just trying to make things, again, very efficient. And so it's like, well, Escapade has to be sneaking inside the Chavit Center. And also I want to have this really emotional conversation between Escapade and Sarabella. Can we do both of those things at the same time? Because they're communicating telepathically. And I was like, why not? Sure. And so, yeah, just stuff like that. And, it really does become about just maximizing like what you can get away with in the 20 pages that you have, really.
I know this is a comics podcast, but I'd be remiss if I didn't at least ask 1 or 2 questions about my girlfriend and I's favorite novel of yours before we go, and that's All the Birds in the Sky.
Oh, yay.
Yeah, so the thing that really stood out to me was the question that's like at the heart of existence that enables self-awareness for some of the characters, and is a tree red? And I was really curious, like, where this question came from, and if like the plot device or like the plot need that it filled came first, or if like the nonsensical question to trigger all these thoughts about existence came first. Like, I'd love to know the origins of that.
Man, I love that you asked about that. That was the thing. Like the writing of All the Birds of the Sky, part of what I loved about that process was that it was very much just like I was just kind of playing around and like going by vibes. And at a certain point, I wrote that bit where the tree asks, "Is a tree red?" Or the birds ask, I guess the parliament of birds ask, "Is a tree red?" And I was like, what does that mean? I'll figure it out later. And so I just and I kept coming back to it because I was sort of fascinated by it, but it just sort of like there was a lot of stuff in that book where I just kind of was kind of just trying to be as use dream logic as much as possible, especially with the magical stuff, and just be like, I'm just going to put some dreamlike stuff in and then kind of figure it out. And over the course of writing that book, I did keep coming back to that question of is a tree red? And it started to become more and more meaningful as I kind of like poked at it and thought about it, because it is this thing of like, can you ever see nature clearly? Can we actually perceive nature? Can nature actually, like, all we can really know of nature is our perceptions of it, which are mediated by our kind of technological existence and our artificial separateness that we've imposed on ourselves from nature. Like, we're not actually separate from nature, but we kind of constructed all these systems to make us feel as though we are separate from nature. And so, is a tree red? I mean, can you ever really know what a tree is, like by looking at it? And like, there was a version of the novel where instead of the answer Patricia gives to that question in the published version, in an earlier draft, at the end of the book, when the tree asks, "Is a tree red?" and Patricia finally is ready to answer, the answer was no, because a tree doesn't have eyes. Because a tree, like colors, are a concept that come from having eyes, which is a thing that like humans and other animals have. And so a tree can't be red because a tree doesn't perceive color in that way. And so that was kind of too complicated to get on the page, but that was kind of what I was thinking about. And there's all these moments throughout the book where Patricia is kind of realizing that she actually, even though she sees herself as connected to nature through her magic, she actually doesn't really understand nature at all. And there's like little subtle moments that I threaded in. So I love that you asked about that. Thank you.
Now, the real thing that like made me want to ask the author herself about this is wondering if you believe if there's an opposite to this question. Like, is there a statement similar to this that could make one realize that they no longer exist, or a prompt that would instead unravel self-awareness if given to a creature, whether it be human, robot, or tree?
Wow, that's such an interesting question. I don't know. If I ever get around to writing the sequel to All the Birds of the Sky, I might have to include that and credit you in the acknowledgments, because that's something that I'm going to be thinking about now. I feel like, I don't know. I mean, I think a statement rather than a question. That's such an interesting, I love that. I actually really might, like, I've sort of noodled on a sequel to All the Birds of the Sky occasionally, and I might actually, that might be the kick in the pants I need to make me start working on it again. But yeah, I don't know.
I'll confess that concept came to me in something of a fever dream I had before I was supposed to record the first episode of this podcast, but felt too sick. But yeah, like I know there's all these things different cultures have that's like some kind of collective statement or self-awareness statement, like the great I am, like of feeling part of God or creation. And all of a sudden realizing like, wait, there's an opposite of that. And it's not I am not, because to not be something, you have to be am something. And so I think maybe this could be like an interpretation of like the anti-life equation from DC Comics and Darkseid and stuff. But
I love that.
Like
that's amazing.
Ever since experiencing something of an ego death a couple of years ago that set me down my current path in life, like I've had this fear of like the opposite of is a tree red, like something I'm going to stumble into, whether it's a phrase or something I'm going to see somewhere. I'm like, oh, I'm not alive anymore. This is all just the last synapses of like my memories firing. And so that's why I had to ask, like, okay, this person might know something. They wrote the book on this.
Wow. No, I'm now going to be thinking about that, because I feel like, again, if I ever get around to writing that sequel, that's something I might think about. I don't know. It's interesting. I love that. Thank you for bringing that up. That's so cool. it feels very sort of Grant Morrison in like the best possible way.
It's funny you should say that, and I'm a little hesitant to share this, but I communed with like a mental projection of Grant Morrison after having this, like in this weird fever dream. And admittedly, it happened the day after reading The Invisibles #3, which is like the Neo, you're in a Matrix moment. But like,
oh yeah,
I got writing advice from my head's version of Grant Morrison, and that then
that's
was
awesome.
Like what kicked my ass into getting to the library and finishing writing my first comic script. So
no way! Oh my god!
Though it's
I mean, I bet Grant Morrison was astral projecting.
the one author that I can believe that's what happened, but even if not, it's like something my brain constructed that inspired some very real action based on symbols and stories I'd previously read. So I'm like, if that's not magic right there of transferring ideas and action and real world consequences via story, then I don't know what is.
I met them one time and they were very cool.
That's the dream.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you for asking that. And thank you for telling me that story. That's so cool. And I love that. And I love that, like, you read my book and read The Invisibles and had this communion with Grant Morrison. And I love that. That's incredible. I'm going to think about that for the rest of the day for sure.
I'll admit, you're one of my girlfriend's like literal favorite novelists, like for quite some time. Like
oh my gosh.
Yeah, you tweeted at her when she came out on Twitter. But she was kind of the guide for me as I was going into this episode of like, okay, read Even Greater Mistakes first, then All the Birds in the Sky, and then dabbled into your other work from there.
Could you mind telling me who your girlfriend is, or is that?
Let's see. She's not active on Twitter, but I'll send you an email with whatever.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I deleted my Twitter, but I'm still on all the other services. So yeah. Anyway, it was so lovely chatting with you. I should get going, but this was so wonderful. Yeah. Thank you so much, and I'll send you the local recording. I'm going to start recording here. Should I tell people where to find me? Or?
Yep. I was just going to ask where the listeners can find you online, Charlie.
Yeah. So I have a newsletter at buttondown.email/CharlieJane. And that's really the best way to keep up with me. That's where I put all my opinions about the universe and pop culture and comics and science fiction and queer stuff, and my, share personal essays and stuff. So that's a good place to look me up. I'm also on all the socials. I'm like Charlie Jane Anders on Tumblr and Instagram. And then those are probably the best ones to follow me on in general. So especially Tumblr. I love Tumblr.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Charlie, for making the time to come on the show. You've seriously made me look like the coolest girlfriend ever right before Christmas. So, yeah, thank you for giving me this chance to interview my girlfriend's favorite writer right before our anniversary.
Well, happy anniversary. Give my love to your girlfriend. And thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was great having you.
Okay, cool. Take care.
All right,
bye-bye.
See you, Charlie. If the listeners at home have requests or recommendations for comics or creators you'd like us to cover in the future, you can send them our way on social media. You can find us on the Transcending Comics Instagram and Facebook page, on Twitter as @TranscendComics, or email us at transcendingcomics@gmail.com. We'd like to thank you for giving our podcast a chance, and give a special shout out to Ray Day Parade for designing our logo. Our intro and outro music this week is A Little Soul and You've Been Starring by Carlson. You can check out more of his music on carlson.com. Join us again next time as we continue transcending boundaries and exploring the colorful world of trans, non-binary, and genderqueer representation in comic books of all kinds. As the curtains fall on this episode of Transcending Comics, remember that comics have the power to inspire change in countless worlds, including our own. Keep reading, keep writing, and keep transcending.